Alright then, so we've already seen how we can handle click events, like when a user clicks on a button, by hooking that click event up to a method, which we then define inside our Vue component. Now, we can do a similar kind of thing with different types of mouse events, things like double click, or mouse over, or mouse leave, etc. So let's take a look at a few of those. So first, what I'm going to do is come back to the template, and I've already created at the bottom of the div with an ID of app a BR tag and a comment, and down here I'm going to create 4 different divs, each one with a class of box, because we're going to use that class to style each one a little bit as well. And we're doing 4 because we're going to look at 4 different mouse events. Now, I've already created styles for this. In the head over here, I've created a style tag, and you can see now that each box has a padding 100 pixels top and bottom, 0 left and right, a width of 400 pixels. We align the text to the center, a background of a light grey color, a bit of margin for each box, and also we display each one as inline block. So if I save this now, we should see those 4 boxes over here. Okay, so I want to now attach a different mouse event to each one. So let me do some text in the middle of each one before I do that. So the first one is going to be a mouse over, and that means basically enter the mouse onto the element. The second one is going to be a mouse leave event. That means exit the mouse. The third one is going to be a double click. And the fourth one is going to be something slightly different, which we'll come back to later. So let's do this one first of all. I'm going to attach an event to this, and remember we can use either v-on, colon, and then the event type, which is mouse over, or we can use, instead of this bit, the @ symbol, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to set that equal now to a function which we will define over in the component. So let me do this. I'm going to call the function handle event, and then I'm just going to log to the console event like so. So now I can reference that over here, handle event like so. If I save that and open up the console, if we go to mouse over the first one, we see event. If I do it again, we see event. Now while I move around inside the box, nothing happens. It's only when I first enter the element we get that event. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one I want to show you is the mouse leave. So let's do that. Mouse leave. And set that equal to the function again, handle event. And in fact, we'll do this one as well. And this is double click. So let's say @dbl click. So that stands for double. And then set that equal to the same function, handle event. Let me save this and preview. And if we come over here, we can now see this one works. When we go into this one, nothing happens. But when we exit, that event fires. And you saw the number 2 here. And then down here, nothing happens when we enter and exit, but if we double click, then we see another event. And we've not done the fourth one. We'll come back to that in a second, but before we do that, I want to talk about the event object as well. So whenever we have events like this that happen in the browser, whether that's double click, mouse leave, mouse over, just a normal click, or any other kind of event, we automatically get access to an optional event object. And that can be taken in as a parameter right here. And it must be the first parameter. So I could type E right here, and you can call it what you want, by the way. You don't have to call it E right here. You can call it EV or event, doesn't matter. But now we can log that to the console. This is automatically passed in as a first argument when we fire an event, when an event occurs. So let me save it and try this again. Now if I mouse over, you see this object right here. It's a mouse event, and if we expand, there's loads of different information about the event. This right here says whether the Alt key was pressed while the event occurred. In our case, it was false. We also have the client X and the client Y. We also have down here whether the control key was pressed, the layer X, the layer Y, offset. There's loads of different things. Also, we have the type down here. That's the type of event that occurred. So let's also log that out. I'm going to say E and E.type, like so. And if I save this, let's try the different events. So this one was mouse over. This is mouse leave. And this is double click, all right? So when an event occurs, you might find it useful to get some of this information. For example, you might want to react to a user when they click something, but only if they're holding Alt as well. Or you might want to update a UI element based on the offset properties, okay? And we will probably use some of these later. And in fact, in a minute, we're going to see an example of that. But before we do that, what if we also want to pass in a custom parameter as well, like we did before? So say, for example, over here, I also want to pass in my own argument. So I can say, for example, I want to pass in a number, which is 5. Now, what's going to happen, because when we did this before, this argument should be therefore the first argument inside here. Now, if I save this, let's see what happens. If I go to the top and mouse enter, we see 5, and E suddenly becomes undefined. So when we pass in our own argument like this right here is the first argument, and we don't get that event object. However, when we're passing our own custom arguments in, we can explicitly say that we want the event object to be passed in as well. And to do that, we say $event, and now this will be the first argument and this will be the second. When we don't pass any arguments in, the event object is automatically the first argument that we receive. But when we do pass our own arguments in, we have to explicitly say that we want the event object in as a parameter as well, and then any of our own parameters or arguments after that. So now, if I save it, we can say E, that will be the event object that we get right here, and we can take in a second optional argument if we want to. For example, we'll call this data, but you can call it what you want. And down here, we'll say if data, if that has a value, then we'll log it to the console. Okay, now I do this if check because we don't always have the data. In these other events, we're not passing through any data as a second argument. We're just getting access to the event automatically as a first argument. But in the first one, that's where we pass in the additional argument, the data, okay? So I hope that all makes sense. Now let's try this. And if we mouse over, we can see we get the event object, then the type, and then the data right here, our own custom argument. And these are still going to work the same way. We automatically get that event object as a first argument. Okay, so now we've learned a little bit about that. Let's have a look at this fourth one I wanted to do. Now, this one is going to be a mouse move event, and I'm going to set that equal to a different function. This one is going to be called handle mouse move, like so. And I don't need to pass anything into that because we're going to get the event object automatically. Now, inside that function, let's define it first. So handle mouse move, like so, and we take in the event object automatically. Inside here, what I want to do is update two properties, and I'm going to create those two properties first. First one is X, and that's the X position within the square that we have the event on, so within this square right here. And then secondly, the Y property. So they're both going to be 0 to begin with. But then what we're going to do is update those when this function is fired, and we can use the properties from the event object to update them. So I'm going to say this.x is equal to e.offset x. So that will be the cursor position within this box. The offset is the offset relative to the top left of the box. So we're going to get that position for x, and we'll do a similar thing for y. So this.y is equal to offset, or rather e.offset y. So now we have those two properties, but we're not doing anything with them. So what I'll do is output them right here. I'm going to say position, and then I'm going to output, first of all, X, and then secondly, Y. So to begin with, they're going to be 0, but whenever the mouse moves around the box, and by the way, this is mouse move, not mouse over. So whenever we move at all within the box, it's going to fire the event. And at that point, we're taking the event object to this function, and we update the values of X and Y, and they will be reflected right here in the template. So we should see them on the screen. So let's give this a whirl. Let's go to the bottom, and you can see at the minute position starts at 0, 0, but the minute I go in, you can see those numbers update. If I go to the top left, it should be very close to 0, 0, like that. If we go to the bottom right, then that's going to be something like 400 and 200 and something. There we go. Okay. So there we go, my friends. That's how we work with other mouse events that we will be using a lot in the future of this course, and also the event object. So there's another directive I want to show you now, and that one is called v-for. And we use v-for to cycle through an array of data and output a bit of template for each item in that array. So imagine we had an array of users, for example, and we wanted to list those on a screen. Then we could use v-for to cycle through that array and output each user in some kind of list. So we're going to do that for books. So we're showing one book right here. But imagine instead of having these 3 different properties here, if I delete those, imagine instead we had a books property, which was an array, and inside we had a list of books, and each book could be an object. So each book could have a title property, which I'll say for the first one is name of the wind, and each book could have an author property, which in this case would be Patrick Rothfuss. Okay, so that would be one book inside this book array. Now I'm just going to paste in 2 more. So we have The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson and The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. So now we have 3 books right here, and we might want to output a bit of template for each one of them. So you might think, well, what we could do is we could come over here and we could say books and then 0 to get the first book, and then dot title, and we could do the same thing for the author right here, and we don't have an age anymore, so let's get rid of that. And then we could do the same for the second book, so let me duplicate this and change this to 1 and this to 1 and so forth, and we could do that for the third book, and it would work. But that's only when we have a small list of books. If this is coming from a database, you might have 50 books or 100 books or even more, and you're not going to do that for each book. And you might not know how many elements you have, so you don't know what number to go up to. So instead, this is where we use something called v-for. So what I'm going to do is instead create a UL, and we want to create an li tag for each book object and output that separately. So let me do that, li, and then I'm going to use v-for on this, and we set that equal to something. Now what we do is say item in, and then whatever you want to cycle through. So I could cycle through books. So I'm going to say item in books. Now this right here, you can call what you want. You can call it book if you prefer, which probably makes more sense, because then we're saying for each book in the books array. So this has to be there, this in, and this has to be last, the array we're cycling through, but the first item can be called whatever you want. So I am going to call it book, and it's going to cycle through each item in the books array, and it's going to output an li tag for each of these books. And inside the li tag, we have access to the individual book as we cycle through them. So for each iteration, this book is going to first be this item, then this, and then this. So we can output the different properties of that book. So I'm going to use an h3 to output the book title. So book.title, like so. And this is the same as this. So whatever you call it here has to be the same here. And then I'm going to do a paragraph tag for the author. So book.author, like so. Save that, and we should see an li tag for each one, which we do. And this still works, this toggle that we had before, because we're still embedding this inside a v-if. So this is how we cycle through data and output a bit of template for each item in that data array, and we will be using that a lot as we start to make projects, because a lot of the time we're working with collections of data, whether that be users or some other kind of resource like blog posts or chats or messages. We want to cycle through them, and that's when we'll be using v-for. So now I'd like to talk about a concept known in Vue as attribute binding. And attribute binding is when we bind dynamic values to HTML attributes. So say for instance we had an anchor tag. The href is an attribute. What if I wanted the value of that to be dynamic? Normally when I create a link, I'd put in a website address here. So http://www.thenetninja.co.uk, and right here I'll just say best website ever. And that would be how I create a normal link, but this is hard coded, this value. If I want it to be dynamic, I need to do something else. Now the first thing I would do is take this value and create a data property, and I've already done that. I've created this URL data property, which is thenetninja.co.uk. So what if I wanted to output that URL data property inside this href right here? Would I just say URL? Well, no, that's not going to work. That's just going to literally think that URL is the href. And if I inspect this, we can see the href is URL. So that doesn't work. Well, what about curly braces like we do in the template? Will that work? Well, again, no. The literal href is going to be curly braces URL. So in order for this value to be dynamic, we have to do something else. We have to do what's known as data or attribute binding. So the way we do this in Vue is by using a directive called v-bind, and then we use a colon and attach it to whatever attribute we want to bind data to. So this means that whatever is inside here now is dynamic. And inside here we can now access the different properties inside our Vue component, including this URL property right here. So now I can type URL, and no longer is it just going to be literally URL. It's going to look for that value inside our component and output it right here, because we've said it's dynamic by using v-bind. So let me save that and preview. If we inspect this now, we can see over here we get the URL property value that's defined in our Vue component. So this is how we use attribute binding. Now again, we tend to use this quite a lot in Vue projects. So instead of always having to write v-bind, we can get rid of that, and whenever we see just a colon, that means we're data binding to that attribute. So this is the same thing, it's just a shortcut for v-bind. Much like we have this @ symbol for events instead of v-on, we have colon for v-bind. And they're probably two of the main shortcuts that we use in Vue.js that are really helpful and that we use a lot. So let me just show you that this still does the same thing. Yep, still works. So we can do this with many different attributes, not just href. So let me comment this out, and you'll notice I've already created this assets folder right here, and inside this we have 3 images, 1.jpg, 2.jpg and 3.jpg, and they're each a book cover. So I want to use these for each book as we output them. So I'm going to create an image tag for each book at the top. So I'll say image, and then each one needs a source and an alt. Now the alt, we're going to bind to that, and to do that, remember, we can just use a colon, or we can say v-bind. I'm just going to use the colon, the shortcut, and I want the value to be the book title. So that is going to be the alt for the image. So let me paste that in. Now the source as well, I want this to be dynamic, but we don't have any kind of data property that we want it to be yet. So let's go over to these books, and let's also create an image property for each one. So each image property is going to be basically a path, the source, to grab one of these. So they're inside the assets folder. So let's say assets/1.jpg for the first one. Now I'm just going to copy that so I don't have to type out each one individually because I'm super lazy. So 2, and then the third one, which is going to be 3. And by the way, these images are all found on the course files GitHub repo. If you just look at the lesson 13 branch right here, and you can see the assets folder, you can download the zip folder or go to each one of these individually and save it to your computer, entirely up to you. But they're all there. But anyway, now we've created these image properties, we can now bind to the source over here by using a colon. And because they're on the book that we have right here, the image properties, we can say book.image. and therefore the source is going to be this for the first one, this for the second one, and this for the third one. So now when we're outputting these, we should see all of those 3 images as well, which we do. So that is data or attribute binding, and again, we are going to be using this a lot as we go through the different chapters and projects in this course. Okay then, so now I'd like to show you how to use dynamic classes, and by that I mean conditionally give elements certain classes based on a certain condition. So for example, for each book that we output, we might want to conditionally give this a class based on the value of something in each book. Now to demonstrate this, I'm going to add another property to each book called isFav, and that stands for isFavorite, and it's going to be a boolean, either true or false. So we'll say true for the first one, and I'm going to copy this and paste it a couple of times. We'll say false for the second one, and then for the third one, we'll say true. Okay, so now we have this isFav property on each one. Is it a favorite book? So what I could do is evaluate that property each time we cycle through a book and conditionally apply a class to this li tag based on that value. If that value is true, I might want to style the li tag a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do is now use some data binding. So we use the colon or v-bind, remember, and then a colon, and we're binding to the class attribute. Now what I want to do is just use the shortcut instead of vbind, and that's what I'll be using going forward, by the way. And then inside here we can pass in an object. Now this object is going to contain key value pairs, and for each key value pair it will be evaluated. The key will be the conditional class that we apply. So I might want this to have a class called fav, and then that will only apply based on the value of that key. If the value evaluates to true, then we'll have this class on the li tag. If it evaluates to false, then we won't have that class. So I'm going to reference the book, which we have right here, and then use the isFav property from that book. So that's going to be true for the first one, it's going to be false for the second one, and true for the third one. So the first and the third should have this fav class. So if I save that now and preview over here and inspect these, we can see that the first one has a class of fav, the second one doesn't because it's not a fav, it was false, but the third one does. So now we could style these a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do is add some styles to the whole page right here. I'm going to come up to the top. We don't need this box style anymore, that was from a few lessons back, and instead what I'm going to do is just paste in a few different styles at a time, because I don't want you to watch me write these out. It's not a CSS course. So the body, we just give a background of a light grey, a max width of 960 pixels, a margin of 20 pixels top and bottom, auto left and right, meaning this 960 pixel column will sit in the middle. The next thing I want to do is strip out the margin and padding from the paragraph, H3 and UL, so we reset those. Then I want to style the li tags, so let me paste this in. And each li tag is going to have a list style type of none, meaning those little things right here disappear, those little circles. Then we give each one a background of white, margin 20 pixels top and bottom, auto left and right, a bit of padding, a bit of border radius to soften the corners. We display each one as flex, and that means that automatically each of these will sit next to each other inside the li tag. And then we align items to the center. That means that all of the items vertically sit in the middle. And then finally we say justify content space between, and that means in the horizontal direction we have equal space between each item. These things right here are used in conjunction with display flex. Now if you do want to learn more about display flex, I've got a whole free course on my YouTube channel about Flexbox, so I'll leave the link attached to this lesson. But anyway, now we've applied those styles, let's take a look at what it looks like. Okay, so this looks a bit better, right? And now I want to style the ones with the fav class a little bit differently. So I could say down here li.fav, and then inside here I'm going to say we want the background this time to be a different hex color, and that will be FF9E and then D2. and that's kind of a pink color. So I also want the color of the text to be white, like so. So now, if we have that fav class, it's colored differently, and we can see at a glance which ones are favorites and which ones aren't. Now, throughout this course, I'm going to be giving you several different challenges so that you can test what you've learned so far. Now, you don't have to do these challenges, but I would highly recommend that you do, because it's in these moments where you're trying to figure out a problem for yourself that you actually learn the most, even if you don't figure that problem out, because you're still thinking about the concepts and thinking about how you might be able to solve it. And that is an important step in learning things, rather than just always watching what someone else is doing. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that you do these challenges. But anyway, the first challenge is to figure out a way to toggle the isFav property of each book when you click on that book on the screen. So right now, the top one has an isFav property value of true, and that's why it's pink, because of that dynamic class. Now, if I was to click this, I want you to then toggle that value to false, and then it would become white. And if I click it again, toggle it back to true, and so forth for each book, okay? Now, to do this, there's going to be two steps involved. The first step is to attach a click event to each li tag. And the second one is that when a user clicks that li, to toggle the isFav property of that book. So it's a relatively simple challenge to begin with, but they will get more taxing as we go through the course and learn more. But don't be disheartened if you don't figure this out, because it's still very early in the course and we've not had that much time to cement the knowledge that we've learned. So just spend a few minutes trying to think about it, and if you don't figure it out, check out my solution in the next video. So then, my friends, hopefully you had a good attempt at this challenge. If you didn't figure it out, don't worry, I'm going to show you my solution now. And your solution might be a little bit different, but generally they should be the same. So the first thing I'm going to do is come to the template, and I want to attach a click event to the li tag for each book. Remember, we get an li tag output for each book. If I just inspect over here, we can see that li, li, li. So that is the thing we want to attach a click event to. Now, to do that, I'm going to come over here and say @click and set it equal to a function. Now, that function is going to be called toggle fav. Now, you could have done it in line here if you wanted to, but I wanted to be a bit more explicit. So I've created this function, and I'm going to go over here and create this method. So toggle fav, and this is going to take in a value, and that value is going to be the book, because right here we need to know which book we are going to update. So I'm going to pass in the book as an argument right here, and we can just say book because we get that book right here. So we have access to it inside this click event, and we pass it into the toggle fav function. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to come to the component again and take in that book. Now, all I want to do is toggle what the value of isFav is. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. The way I would do it is by saying the book, which we take in right here, dot isFav is equal to book dot isFav. So what that will do is say, okay, if the current value is true, reverse that and then assign it to the value of isFav for that book. So that's all it's ever going to do. If it's true, it's going to reverse it to false. If it's false, it's going to reverse it to true. So that would toggle it either way. So if I save this and preview, let's see if it works. Click it and it unfavorites it. Click it again and it favorites it. Okay? And that works for each li tag. So again, you might not have done this exactly the same. There are numerous ways to do it, and this is just my solution. Now, there's one more concept that I want to discuss before we finish this chapter, and that is computed properties. So at first, when you start to use computed properties, it might all seem a little bit complicated, unnecessary, and strange, but they are really useful, and the more you use them, the more you see that, and we will be using them going forward. So in a nutshell, a computed property is a way to define a data property inside our component that depends on other data that we have inside that component that we might have up here. So for example, we might want to create an array which is called filtered books. Now, that filtered books array would depend on the books array that we have here. It's dependent on this data, and if this data changes, then our filtered array would change. Now, that filtered array might be an array of books whereby we only include books that are currently favorites. So how do we make this computed property then? Well, the first thing we do is we create a computed property inside the component object itself. Much like we have methods, we have computed as well. Then inside that, we create a function. So I'm going to call this filtered books. And this function will return a value. And then we can access that value by using this inside the template. So whatever we return here, we can access in the template. So if I just return, for example, a string saying hello, I know this makes no sense, but if I try to use this computed property inside the template, then it will give me that value. Now I'm just going to do this at the top over here, paragraph tag, and I'll output filtered books like so, and save it, and we can see we get this hello value. All right, so it works the same way as normal data properties in that respect. But we don't want to do this. We don't just want to return a value like this. Otherwise, we could have just done that up here. We could have created a property called filtered books inside the data object, which was hello. So this makes no sense. Like I said before, a computed property is a property that depends on other data. And then when that other data changes, this will update. Vue will look at that other data and update our value over here because it's dependent on it. So what I want to do is return a filtered array based on this. And to do that, I'm going to say take this .books, and remember that's how we access the different properties inside our component. We say this to reference the component and then whatever data property we want. And I'm going to use the JavaScript method filter. Now, if you don't know what this method does, definitely check out the last chapter in this course where I go through different array methods. It's covered there. But essentially, this fires a callback function for each item inside the books array. And it's going to fire that function. And if we return true each time we fire that function, we keep that item in the array. If we return false, then we're going to filter that item out of the array. So we fire a callback function for each item, and then we need to return either true or false right here. Now, each time we iterate through, we get access to the book we're currently iterating. So I can pass it in right here, and I want to return true if it's a favorite. So I can just say book.isFav. Now, that is either going to be true or false as we cycle through. So as we fire a callback function for each item, the first one is true, so that remains in the new array. If it's false, it's taken out of the array, it's filtered out. That's what the filter method does. And we're going to end up with an array whereby this one is filtered out. And we should then only have this one and this one in it. And that is the value that we're returning, that filtered array. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go over to the template, and instead of cycling through the books, I'm going to cycle through filtered books now. And now we should only see the books which are favorites, which we do. Awesome. Now, if we change one of those by clicking it, it becomes not a favorite, and therefore we shouldn't see it. Like so. Like so. And then if we refresh, we get those books back. Okay? So that is computed properties for you in a nutshell. It's a way to define data properties which depend on other data. And again, we will be using them more in different places as we go forward.